All right, so welcome everyone. Welcome to the Beyond Growth series. This is hosted by the IDN. I'll let JP speak to the International Degrowth Network, and we'll take it from there.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. Thank you again so much for joining today. We're really excited about our Beyond Degrowth talk series. As mentioned, I'm JP. I use he, they pronouns. I'm from Mexico City, and we're currently both in Paris. Very coincidentally, because we don't live in the same country, so this is great. We've been working hard to invite excellent speakers to provide better perspectives from different regions of the world, which I will explain more about in a second. But this event was organized by the Global South Working Group Circle of the International Degrowth Network. The IDN is an organization, a network essentially, that was created a couple of months ago, just before the 9th International Degrowth Conference in Zagreb. The IDN is currently composed of over 35 groups from around the world, and those encompass over 4,000 individuals. The IDN was constructed to have a more collaborative, cohesive, and cooperative degrowth movement with several particular aims to raise awareness, to push for strategy and working together, and particularly to become better allies with movements that have been working for centuries from the majority world. Aya will speak more about this in a second, but just before we begin, just a couple of little tech rules. Again, this is a conversation. It is much more fun when people have their cameras on and it feels like, we're not just talking to a bunch of screens. Likewise, if you want something, use the chat for whatever purpose you want. Please, nothing offensive. Ask questions in the chat. We will have a dedicated space for Q&A. Please keep yourself muted for the first part of the talk. And most importantly, enjoy, learn, take notes, and welcome.
Yeah. So just a brief about myself. My name is Aya. I'm from Egypt and Palestine, and I'm part of the Global South Working Group. So what is this Global South Working Group? Part of our mission as this circle within the IDN is centered on kind of being a bridge between degrowth movements and the Global South, and discussing how can we be true allies. And then from our own experiences, we realize that from our communities, people are apprehensive and hold reservations when it comes to degrowth. When I speak to people in Egypt about degrowth, they're like, what do you mean degrowth? We're already degrowing. So that's where the idea of Beyond Degrowth came to us. And it kind of invites us to really push the boundaries within degrowth and really look into the blind spots of this movement. So really, at its core, it's like, how can we engage with solutions that are centering the realities of the global majority at its heart? And so without further ado, this is why we kind of came up with this series. Would love to introduce our speaker. We're extremely honored and excited to have you with us, Liepollo Pheko, today. She is a decolonial African feminist and senior research fellow at the Trade Collective. Her research interests are in African political economy, coloniality, states and nationhood, international trade, and global financial governance. Her work is grounded in race, class, and feminist analysis, and she's committed to grounding academic research in community struggles and context. She is also a fellow of the African Futures Lab, and truly, we're very, very honored and thankful for you to be with us here. So I'm just going to kind of start the conversation rolling to say, like, you were recently at the Beyond Growth conference, and when I was watching far away online, I was looking for like Global South session perspectives, and I only found one, which you were a part of. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this experience and how you got into the degrowth movements and your critiques to this movement as a whole.
Yeah, thanks, Aya, JP, for the warm introduction, for the platform. And thanks to everybody here, including some familiar faces, a couple of friends, and a couple of colleagues that have taken the time to join. So I'll start exactly there. Firstly, I don't see myself as a degrowth scholar. I don't actually see myself as a degrowth economist. It's an and I find myself listed as one of the degrowth people to read, which is gratifying, but it's not quite true. And I'll tell you why in a moment. It's actually to do with exactly my impressions of the Degrowth, the Beyond Growth conference, which is about a year ago now, wasn't it, in Brussels. And my impression of that was firstly that it was very much, of course, a Eurocentric, Euro-centered meeting, and trying to seek hope, make conversations, and make sense of a very complex geopolitical time, especially in the wake of the COVID pandemic. And I think it's worth also saying that, like many things, there's an afterlife to COVID. There's an afterlife to the pandemic, and it has reminded us of many other things that are essentially wrong, systemic errors, structural failures, and how the neoliberal complex continues to speak to that afterlife and continues to give life to that afterlife, right? So the second thing, because it was very much a Euro-centered conference, and I don't have any objection to that per se, there was a sense in which one felt tokenized, I think. And I think that the perspective of this is that if we're going to have a meeting, a gathering, a family gathering, as it were, which is basically, it felt like a European family gathering, it's also important then to be very clear about what the parameters of change, of radical shifting can be, whether you know, one is invited into these spaces to give a critical analysis as an external ally per se, or as an external, a critical friend, as I call it, particularly given the behavior of the European Union, parts of Canada, the US, during the COVID pandemic, the vaccine imperialism and vaccine racism that took place. If these are the sorts of, if it seems like an ideal space and place, then to have a conversation, whether it's calling out or calling in as well. It's also a very important opportunity to then think around how Eurocentrism, Eurocenteredness is then impacting on other parts of the world, yeah? So we've seen this in the context of the response to the Ukraine, the resources that are being poured there, versus the responses to places like Palestine. And I have to say, like many people, you know, Aya, we stand in deep solidarity with what is happening there, especially as survivors of settler colonial apartheid ourselves. And again, these things have afterlives. And I think the second piece is in the context of other many, you know, conflicts like Tigray, DRC, and so on, and how there's just a lack of interest in having conversations that humanize the broader humanity. How some lives are just so much more precious than others. And if we're talking about well-being economics, if we're talking about solidarity economics, if we're talking about solidarity states, and the European Union that is in solidarity with other parts of the world, these sorts of anomalies and these sorts of this kind of exceptionalism, one can't help to notice it, and one can't help to notice the racism of it, yeah? That it's deeply steeped in a sense in which some lives are more important, that white lives matter and black and brown lives are clearly not as valuable. And we've seen this in the reporting and so on, but we've also seen this in the context of your Brexits, in the demonization of, and the increasing, you know, the increasing dehumanization, and also, I think, monsterization of the other, yeah? So the notion that those people, and I think that those people is also selective, because when we look at the movement of people, the migration of labor, the migration of low-cost labor within Europe and to Europe from the majority world, it's clear that, in fact, it is those people who are still subsidizing a lot of the European economy, particularly the reproductive economy, the so-called care economy. I have the opportunity to travel across Europe at least a couple of times a year. I have yet to see a white housekeeper, whether it's in Belgium, whether it's in the UK. I have yet to see a anybody who's non-white who's white making my bed, right, or cleaning my sheets, or changing my towel. So this also speaks to the idea of the invisible economy, which maintains, firstly, a cognitive sense of superiority that, you know, seems to be what I was experiencing at the Beyond Growth conference. Secondly, a sense in which others remain othered. And thirdly, this selective racism where Black and brown labor is welcome, but certainly Black and brown ideations, skills, and certain and economic and egalitarian economics are not welcome. And this then spills out into the way that, of course, global labor systems and global economics, globalization, begin to conflate in order to then re-inscript this sense in which the economy is only built along a very neo-imperial, neo-colonial framework, which suits the global minority, whereas the rest of us are only laborers. We're only consumers often of things that we don't want, culture that we don't want, music that we don't want, and so on, but are not seen as producers in a way that is on an equal footing. And the only time that we are seen as producers, then many times our food, our culture, the things that are the best about us are extracted. So, you've heard the saying, I'm sure, Aya and JP, that people love the Black, but without Black people. People love the brown, but without brown people. What would Europe be without a kebab, an Indian restaurant, without a Caribbean restaurant, without reggae music, and so on and so forth? And yet none of these conversations were taking place in the Beyond Growth, the complexity of what it means not only to be a Black and brown person who is also European, and I also spent, by the way, 16 years of my life living in Europe, so I get it, but also what it means to be then in solidarity with other parts of the world. So yeah, those were my impressions as.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think those impressions were echoed even as someone from the Global South who was watching it afar and trying to see how are we actually engaging with the realities of most of the world, and are we really looking at the core of it, as you just said, these international power relations and structures. So I just want to hear from your perspective, like, what is your critique of the degrowth in itself? Where do you see its limitations? Where do you see its applicabilities or synergies? And from there, how can this degrowth movement start to be a true ally?
Yeah, interesting one. So I think the contention with degrowth is languaging. So people talk about how some people in some circles, some people feel that degrowth makes things worse. And I think the problem with degrowth, Aya and JP and the comrades on the call, is that it is used and utilized in a geographically and historical vacuum. It doesn't understand, it doesn't want to own up to the fact that we're not all coming from the same playing field, and that the global architecture is quite toxic. The global economic and labor architectures and political architectures are very toxic. They're coming from a place of what I've called white minority rule or Eurocentric minority rule, which the rest of the world, the majority world, has then, of course, adopted, whether through institutions like your World Trade Organization, the World Bank, the IMF, the United Nations, the courts of justice, the World Health Organization, and so forth. But that these are essentially minoritarian constructs, minoritarian institutions, which then have become popularized or have been imposed by the power of minority rule, by the power of resources, military force, political force, regime change on other parts of the world. And then as a result of this, we then see that we don't view degrowth, for example, as a degrowth in global inequality, as a degrowth away from white privilege, as a degrowth and a disinvestment from the political power and the political privilege that comes with that white privilege. The fact that countries like NATO have a particular view on global politics, on a militarization. We don't see a degrowth in the militarization of everyday life, the militarization even of healthcare, of education, of access to housing, and so on. We also don't see a degrowth in the way that global distribution continues to be so skewed in favor of a few minority nations. And I think degrowthers have thought and have imagined that what is going to happen is that there's going to be an increase in consumption through the growth through redistribution effect, and that hopefully that inequality would then begin to minimize or bring down economic growth in the minority world, and then that hopefully this will have a redistributive effect across the majority world. That really isn't happening. That I don't see how that can happen, because some of the debates that I've had with many people, many good colleagues in the degrowth movement and other heterodox economic movements, is the fear of losing privilege, the fear of losing a way of life. Somebody actually said that the fear of ceding a particular lifestyle. What does this mean? Does this mean that we can't have the lifestyle that we have earned? And when you remember the geopolitics and the geohistory of how resources, power, people have been extracted from the majority world to then feed into the economies and the lifestyle and the bed making of the minority world, you can understand what a strange and quite discombobulating worldview that is. I think the other thing, when we speak about the degrowth movement, is that it also suggests that all growth is unambiguously bad, and that it also means that we can't have some kind of a degrowth transition. The growth in fascism is bad, no doubt about it, right? The growth in racism is bad. The growth in the racialized forms of World Bank and IMF prescripts on majority world countries, which means that countries remain indebted for generations, intergenerationally. That is undoubtedly bad. But I think that to say that degrowth as a uniform, universal, uncritical, without to say uncritically that degrowth is the way forward, without situating degrowth within a historical context, a political context, a political economic context, a context that understands that we come from different political geographies and economic geographies, which, though they are intertwined because of globalization, often have their own very deep context, histories, her stories, and that there is also a loss of sovereignty that many people in the majority world also fear. So because we have been so, I think, I don't know, is bullied a strong word? Well, I'll use the word. I think bullied, browbeaten into this institutionalized, coercive global governance, which is really northern-led governance, which the rest of us have to, put up with, or else, basically. There is, I think, a very low appetite for further prescripts. I think there's a higher appetite for us thinking around economies of scale, which are actually context-specific, which are actually city-specific, country-specific, sometimes even region-specific. So one of the work that I've done with my colleague, Ritu, who did a couple of pieces of research, one for Oxfam, one for Action Aid. But one of the things that we found was basically that it was very difficult for us to even imagine a system that is so devolved away from GDP without thinking around regional or city or country or even town specificities. And one of the, we enjoy, I think, normal orthodox economies, and hence the love, this addiction to the GDP, the love and the addiction to indices that are measurable, that are universal, is this sense of consistency, this sense of sameness, this false sense in which we can, if we all do the same things in the same way, everybody lands at the same place. And we've seen over the past 30, 40 years, especially during this era of structural adjustment, that just is not true. It just isn't true. The playing field is not level, the game is rigged, and so on and so forth. So I think for many of those reasons, when people think about degrowth, there's a hesitancy, there's a reluctance, and there's a sense in which we need to articulate much more clearly what it is that is being ungrown, degrown, or even post-grown. I mean, there's just so many, you choose your poison.
Yeah, thank you for that. Just on the word itself, I remember I was speaking to someone who was more or less like a farmer in Egypt, and I'm talking about degrowth, and he's like, "What do you mean? Growth is good. Like my trees, my fruits grow, my harvests grow." He's like, so like when you this word kind of again. like detaches from the realities, what people actually see growth as something very positive in the global south in different contexts. So I wanted to ask you, like, if we were to start tipping the scales of the power imbalances, like what are actually the pathways to decoloniality in the manifestations of international trade and the global architecture? Like, how do we untangle ourselves from this?
There are a few things. I mean, I think the one thing is to firstly decenter GDP as the only and the best and the primary way of measuring the well-being, the health, the progress, the growth of a society, and to rethink what it is that is being grown. So, for example, we understand that GDP doesn't measure human well-being. It doesn't measure, it doesn't measure the care economy, social reproduction, and the cost of that social reproduction, the cost of actually reproducing generations, which is immense, and without which nothing else can function. There will be no future workers, future teachers, future lawyers, future anything if that doesn't happen. It doesn't also measure the quality of life qualitatively, not only and quantitatively as well. It doesn't measure the cost of joy and happiness and how perhaps sometimes being in jobs that are awful, spending time commuting, being in debt, intergenerational poverty, all of these things, a sense of despair even. It doesn't measure how difficult it is to go to sleep at night, not knowing whether you're going to wake up in the morning and hoping perhaps that you don't wake up in the morning because you have no idea what you're going to feed your children the following day. So GDP, it doesn't speak to, for example, the cost of war. And we understand that, of course, war is big business, unfortunately. The military industrial complex is part of the most profitable in the world, in which many countries are implicated. It also is silent. It's completely silent on some of the ongoing and previous oppressions that I've mentioned, colonialism, genocide, the slave trade, the trafficking of African people to other worlds, and so forth. It is also completely silent on indigenous knowledge, and it centers a particular supremacist white supremacist male way of viewing the world in all of its manifestations. So I think different ways of doing this is to center the social reproduction and the social infrastructure in multiple ways, in culturally appropriate ways, and in trying to center different ways of systems of care. And that, I think, is also understanding that the guiding principles of our economy has to be around the collective as well as the individual well-being of people and planet, and understand that there is a symbiotic relationship between ourselves and this earth that we live on. It's also to understand that there's a link between the people who have passed and the people who have yet to come. So this idea that we've been loaned this earth for our children is one that I think has become, it's a bit of a t-shirt, it's a bit of a bumper sticker, and yet it's actually one of the truest things that we can think around, because it would mean that we then ensure equitable, redistributive resources, a distribution of economic, financial, ecological, labor, particularly from the global north to the majority world and to non-white women. It also speaks to the notion of reparative economics, which is one that I am playing with, thinking of at the moment, reparative or reparational economics, because when we, I think my good colleague Jason Pheko, who's also a well-being ambassador, has done a lot of interesting work in this regard, as have some, as have some other feminist economists as well. But, talking about the cost of the global economy, what is owed to this generation from previous generations, for example, what is owed in terms of time, what is owed in terms of years lost of labor, what was donated and extracted from previous generations. So the past is always with us. So that also causes us to think, it compels us to rethink the way that we view the economy as something that is static in the here and now, rather than an intergenerational linear link from where we were to where we are now. Another is then to think about the plurality of economics, the plurality of economic models, and that the dominant model is clearly not working in the way that it should, and it needs to shift. So there are multiple alternative models in place. There's feminist economics, there's well-being economics, there's feminist well-being economics that a few people, myself included, are writing and contributing to in real time quite vociferously. It also then makes us think around the various and multiple crises of capitalism and the multiple pandemics of capitalism. So to go back to my original opening remarks, where COVID as a pandemic, but as really the latest of many pandemics. And I've said this over since 2020. I think I've been one of many people who have been saying that it then has forced us to think around parallel economies, sometimes called the informal economy, community economics, solidarity economics. And it also means that we need to redefine wealth as a community asset and recognize that value and labor, they go far beyond a really narrow financialized meaning, and that wealth is created through both paid and unpaid labor. It's created through time as well, however that time is recognized, and that it has to be centered around people and an environment, and around those who are the most marginal, the most dispossessed, the ones who are least likely to be able to get ahead in such an uncompassionate society. It also has to recognize that the people who carry out the essential labor, who are primarily women, such as social reproduction, food production, the ones who sustain and reproduce generations and human life, then these structures have to shift into a space of recognition and what I would call liberatory action. And then this includes other things, the structural issues we can talk about later. But I think, the issues around the formation of the IMF, the centering of the World Bank, the institutionalizing of debt and indebtedness, the denuding of states, the incapacity of states to behave like states, for example, the fact that many countries have less GDP and less wealth at their disposal than multinational companies. The fact that there are companies that can go to the World Trade Organization and sue nations because these nations have put in place, I think very reasonably so, have put in place preferences around their own local producers, for example, have tried to prevent dumping, have tried to prevent the monopolization of particular industries and particular sectors like IT and so on. I think there are companies like Lenovo, for example, has taken countries to the WTO. Philips is another one. It's your huge multilateral conglomerates. The good news in this is that the WTO, I think some of us are aware, they just had their 13th ministerial meeting, just ended now at the end of February, was that it was just such an anticlimax. But what did come out of that is that we are seeing an increasing commodification of agriculture, an increasing commodification of many of the a redressing, really, a rolling back of many of the battles that a lot of agricultural and artisanal workers and farmers from the majority world, the gains that they had made around seed sovereignty, for example, agricultural sovereignty, and so on, rolled back in the name of this kind of new forms of agricultural cartel. So the more things change, the more things stay the same. But I think one glimmer in all of this is that, for example, the WTO is becoming quite peripheral. I think, there was a time when, I wasted a decade and a half of my youth being a WTO groupie of note. And it's now not something that I take much notice of because of plurilateralism, because of the many bilateral agreements that are flying around, and again, eroding states, again, eroding institutions, again, eroding transparency, because many states are supposed to report if they're going to enter into an agreement at the WTO. Hardly anybody does anymore. And we've seen the way that the US and China, for example, they just take their battles out like kids coming out at break time in the playground, and they just have it out there. Hardly anybody takes notice. But it does show that to some extent some of these institutions can become less relevant, but not for the right reason. So there's a whole laundry list of things that I think that could be different, Aya and JP. Yeah.
Thank you for that. And if we were like to zoom out from the architecture towards the people, what do you think that people can specifically do towards reclaiming their own sovereignty, especially like in places like Africa and Asia? What do you think that people can do to challenge these narratives?
It's a big question, and it's a fabulous question. I think it's one that I'd actually like us to try and tackle together. There's interesting movements that are already taking place. I mean, I'm proud to be part of the Wellbeing Alliance, which is seized with some of these questions. And happy to see some of my very good colleagues on this call, so perhaps they can also jump in. I think that what this does is that it does show that, for example, there are governments which can do things differently. There are governments and even cities, municipalities, which are trying to decenter away from this neoliberal model of service provision. The idea of people as citizens, not consumers, right? That's a very important thing for us to deconstruct. So the idea that you have to pay for an education, that's qualitative, I think is obscene, personally. I think the idea that you have to pay to go to get a particular, medical attention. I mean, if you want fancy stuff like, I don't know, plastic surgery, a BBL, by all means pay for that. But the basics should certainly not be, the basics, life-saving, life-sustaining treatment that everybody is entitled to. Is certainly not something that I think should be paid for. So I think that we are beginning to reconstruct and deconstruct even the distinction between citizen and consumer, and there are different social movements which have begun to do that. I mean, I know even in South Africa with the Soweto Electricity Crisis Center, which doesn't exist anymore, but what that was very useful for was for reminding the state, especially post-apartheid South Africa, that we can't have a liberatory framework which still disenfranchises and still excludes a majority of people. We still can't. And even now, in the midst of, for example, the many elections that are taking place across the world, there are several social movements, labor movements, who are talking about what it means to vote. How important is it to vote differently and to rethink what our mandate is? And I think that I would really encourage us to think about this, because I think as of this year, I think there are 64 countries that are going to the polls, right? And I think including the European Union, and it's some of the big ones. It's South Africa, it's the United States, it's the UK, it's quite a few others even across the African continent. It's India. Basically half of humanity this year is going to be transacting power. So I think conversations such as this have the opportunity for us to rethink and to reframe the sort of governance that we want, the sort of polity that we want. We actually, there was a poll that was done in South Africa a few weeks ago, and it was quite startling that if people, the people aged between 18 and 30, well, I think that's 10 million voters now, they could potentially, if they all decided to go and vote, they could potentially vote in a completely new government. And in fact, that is the total of the people who voted in the ANC in 1994. So if we think through as a voter bloc across our countries, notwithstanding voter apathy, and I actually don't think that apathy is the word we're looking for. I think disappointment, I think anger, I think outrage. I think those are some of the things, the terms that we are grappling with, because I speak to many people, even the people who say they haven't voted and they're not interested. That alone is an hour-long coffee with a brownie thrown in, because once people start to unpack what it is they're unhappy with, people feel unseen, they feel lied to. Many young people, for example, feel as though they are only exactly powerlessness and hopelessness. They're only there as vote fodder, right? They're only there for the elections. They're only there to fill stadiums. They're only there for the adverts, for the T-shirts, and then after that, the state or the government completely forgets about them. And this is a global trend. I'm privileged to travel quite broadly. This is not just South Africa. It's not just Kenya. Talk to people in the US, the UK, friends in India, friends in China, friends in France. It's a global phenomenon. And I think that Aya, is a space and a place for us to rethink and to craft demands about what kind of economy that we want, what kind of new economies of solidarity do we want, what are we seeing in the mandates, in our manifestos as well? I mean, I hope that most people don't have the challenge of South Africa, which is 600 parties that are on the electoral roll, at the IEC that exist. And then I think out of those, there are probably about 120 which are actually qualified to run in these elections. So there's a lot. We are spoiled for choice. It's overwhelming. So one could argue that, look, the homework that we have is to actually, and that's whatever country you're in, European Union, UK, US, wherever you may be, to look at the kind of manifestos that are available and to think, well, which is the one that I can influence? Can I join a movement? Can I potentially join the Green Party? Who can I join that somehow aligns with me and begin to infuse this sort of ideation? Because it's small, it's tiny things. It's not going to be, the UN isn't collapsing anytime soon. The WTO isn't, it's not that relevant, but it's not collapsing anytime soon. The IMF is a bulwark, isn't it? The World Bank and so on. And I think that what we can do is to also look at the other small scale mass movements which are emerging from this, right? The radical movements that have been emerging in resistance. And that's always where the blade of the grass, as I call it, the grass blade movements, student movements, which we have a plethora of, labor movements, especially the smaller labor movements, not so much the huge confederations, because those are often captured, often in, sometimes too aligned to government, too aligned to big businesses and blurry. But I think the smaller labor movements, which are the ones that I've worked with in the past, also tend to offer a much more responsive way of viewing the potential for different things. Smaller co-ops even, and the way that people are even looking around, the purchasing choices that we can make, the support. I mean, the kids always laugh because I'll drive across town if I can, to find something rather than going to a supermarket. I mean, it's only at the last, if it's a desperate thing, but I'm always like, let's support the underdog. That's always my thing. If we can support smaller scale markets, small artisanal markets, and so on, smaller scale producers, let us do that. I think for most people on this call, I would imagine, have a level of privilege, which is why we're able to tune in as well. And I think that it is upon us to be able to make those sorts of choices which are of inconvenience, because this struggle is one of inconvenience. It is one of saying, I can't go into, Sainsbury's or Pick and Pay or Checkers or whichever other, sort of supermarkets that you have. I have to make different choices. It is about saying that I'm not the one I don't want to consume stuff from Amazon, for example. So, I mean, I'm that person who can't order books from Amazon and deliveries from Amazon, because I'm just like, it's a lot. Am I really going to be that person who's going to put more petrol in Jeff Bezos' spaceship so he can go to space? Am I going to contribute to that? Right? Is that going to be us? And I think those seem like small things, but the problem with these kind of global capitalist conglomerates and monocapitalism, Microsoft, for example, is that they have lulled us into the sense that there is no other way, which is a great Thatcherite mantra, wasn't it? There is no alternative. That's exactly what they have done. They've lulled us into a sense that this is how it is. It's Netflix or Netflix. It's Uber or it's Uber. It's Amazon or it's Amazon. And it's simply not true. But we have hindsight, I can't answer it alone, but we have the collective homework of constantly looking for different communities of practice, smaller cooperative models, smaller purchasing and lending models. Some people who are into clothes swapping because they want to divest from the whole fast fashion thing. And we know that fast fashion is also ecologically unhealthy, and it's also very unhealthy for the women who have to produce that fashion in very, very rapidly, only for it to be thrown away 3 months later. All of that. Back to you, Aya and JP.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I guess what you said at the end, the change we want to see in the world, if I can't implement that change within myself in this tiny thing, then how do we expect the world to ripple out. So yeah, and even if it's an inconvenience, the struggles that people actually go on through on the day-to-day is the greatest inconvenience. So it's the way to be true, to show true solidarity. So I just want to, before we open it up to questions, see if you have any further remarks or things you want to lay or share with the group over here before we move on to Q&A.
I had some questions or comments in the chat there. Maybe that those folks would like to.
Do you want to put questions for me? You can go. Just, sorry, 1 second. Switching computers. Can folks hear me? Great. So this is an open space for questions. There's been quite a few questions in the chat. Again, we really want to make this as inclusive as possible. That's why we can shift the camera a little bit. So if you want to make it more like a conversation, please do turn on your video. We saw quite a few questions. But please keep them coming in the chat, and we can pick out some names. And you can ask your question live yourself. One of the first ones was from Martin. Martin, would you like to speak up?
Hey, sure. Yeah. Hey, everybody. So nice to see all of you. A lot of familiar faces. Hey, so I just, yeah, I totally hear your points. And just at the beginning, maybe I was a little bit unsure of whether you were criticizing degrowth, or maybe well-being economics, or maybe steady-state economics, or maybe post-growth, or maybe a certain like institutionalized version of the concept, because a lot of the decolonial, class, geographical, global south perspectives and pluriversal notions that you were kind of pointing out as lacking perhaps in the literature are very much at the core of what degrowth thinking is about, which is about decolonizing the imaginary and basically degrowing inequalities between global north and south, acknowledging different ways of world making, of being, of living, and just being in tune with other forms of relating to life, and just allowing those forms to exist, and thereby kind of acknowledging that capitalism is a system that cannot acknowledge those forms, and degrowth is a term that is like inherently anti-capitalist because capitalism is about growth. It's dependent to growth. And obviously the whole idea of the term is to be a missile word that capitalism cannot co-opt, right? And so anyways, without going into too much detail, I just wanted to kind of, yeah, point out that a lot of the criticism you do address seem to be very relevant perhaps for some of these donor economics or well-being economics principles that might not have such a decolonial kind of inherent and anti-capitalist inherent kind of underpinnings. But I would say that they don't so much apply to degrowth. So the question is, what do you think?
Sure. I wasn't sure if Aya and JP wanted to take a few questions at a time or whether I can just jump in, but I think I'll jump in because I think it's quite involved. So thanks, Martin. I mean, I saw that earlier and I was like, oh, this is juicy. So I think, I mean, I agree and I disagree. And I think, I think also within the degrowth heterodox economic movement, there is space for divergence and there's space for diversity, even within the same school of thought. My concern with degrowth, and one that many, few of us share with degrowth, is that even though it claims to be decolonial, and I know that some of the founding leading lights in that movement have used the wording of decoloniality, right? Is that they don't really, firstly, it's very much situated in a global north experience. That alone is already a limitation in conceptualization, in thinking, and in its world perspective, right? And I think positionality is something that is very important at how to determine how we come at some of these issues. I think another piece of that is that it there are many empirical claims that it makes around, for example, the dichotomy between capitalism, for example, and other forms of heterodox redistributional models. But my thinking and my observation on that has always been that it hasn't seemed to really tinker away and deal with some of the questions of privilege that I also mentioned earlier on. And I think another piece of that is that even though we're talking about degrowth in the context of ungrowing pollution, ungrowing planetary excess, ungrowing the assault on the planet, for example, the degrowth movement still uses languaging many times in many of the literature, languaging that gives itself away. So languaging of, for example, rich country. Now, for all the reasons that I've mentioned, we cannot describe countries of the global north as rich, as though they might be enriched countries. But historically, there's a context and a meaning, whilst describing others as poor nations, developing nations, least developed nations. So I think that this alone is a huge blind spot, and it's one that I'll stand by. It's a ongoing debate, and I'm very happy to lovingly and respectfully remain in this kind of engagement and debate with my peers and people like good wise people like yourself. But I think I insist that this positionality is one that is still steeped in a northern bias, and even though it speaks around decoloniality, it doesn't understand it in a way that's transformative and liberatory.
Thank you. Martin, just wondering if there's anything you'd like to respond?
Well, maybe if I could just add a point, like I think I totally agree with you that there's some currents within the degrowth movement, because it's a very wide movement. It's a plural movement. Of course, I don't kind of pretend that there's just one vision of degrowth. But if there is to just kind of conceptualize the plurality of different degrowth thinkings, I do believe that the things that you're pointing to, those that do talk still of rich countries or developed versus developing, or that still have a very economic centric perspective, or even think of degrowth economics. In many ways, degrowth is to go beyond economics. It's to even ditch the field of economics and ditch even the existence of academic fields in the first place, so that we can actually think of science in a transdisciplinary manner. The points that you do point to, those literatures that do kind of replicate these things, I think are a minority within the degrowth literature, if at all, and very often don't even use the term degrowth, but rather post-growth, which I think is important to clarify. And post-growth is a much less transformative idea, and I think it's important to really kind of reiterate the fact that this is true, this exists, but I don't think it's the mainstream. Like the majority of the degrowth movement falls into those pitfalls that you just mentioned.
Thank you, folks. We have space for several more questions. I see that Pooja definitely wants us to ask a question. Pooja, would you like to ask it yourself?
Hey, JP, I'm rolling a very bad network zone, so may I request you to read that? Thank you.
Sure, of course. Yeah. Not this one. Oh, it's further up. Question. As we know, degrowth calls for ecological reparations to address the harm done by colonial extractivist development, waste colonialism, and climate colonialism. Is for really in the global south. We are witnessing overt social injustices, especially in the garment industry, mostly in the hands of fast fashion brands situated in the global north. The global south is still trying to evolve and get back on its feet with economic development rather than environmental restoration. How will degrowth find its place here? I'm wondering if that's a question for us, or for you. Yeah. Would you like to take it on, and then maybe we can chime in as well?
Sure, as you wish, no problem. Sure. So, I mean, that's another fantastic question, and I love it because it also links in very well with the notion of reparations. And I think what's important in this is that there are many scholars and activist scholars in the majority world or the global south who are also making this observation and who are making these links between climate reparations and the economy and the political geography that I spoke to of that, the economic geography that I spoke to of that. One of the things as well is that, it's also important in this is to remember that even in that, however, and that the climate debate is also one that we can't have in isolation of the colonial debate. And I know most people on this call are well aware of this, but it is, again, very important that it isn't so obscured by a debate around reparative justice that we forget what it is that is being repaired and why, what has been taken and from whom. And I think that even though we are talking around replenishing the planet and replenishing particular regions and territories, that there was a time when people, certain people in territories were viewed as non-people, and that in this dehumanization and in this plunder, which has been part of the colonial and imperial project as well, that there's a history and a her story to it. And I think that this is, again, an interesting and important, very important entry point for different kinds of well-being economics, decolonial well-being economics, because it also brings to bear heritage. It brings into bear languages that have been lost, for example. It brings into bear cultures that have been lost, stewardship, spiritualities, forms of community, forms of being, forms of living, forms of acting, and forms of doing. And I think that there's a layer of nuance even within this reparative debate and reparative work that is being done, and analysis that is very necessary, that is being done within the climate, the intersection between climate reparations and political reparations has to be made, I think, much more closely, in fact. And that if we consider economies to be less important, which in fact, I want to agree to some extent with Martin, that when we're talking about degrowth, we're also talking to a place beyond economies. We're talking about relationality that isn't only financial or financialized. Yeah, it's not only about the exchange of goods and services. It's the exchange of humanity. It's the practice of humanity. And so in repairing that humanity, we also repair ourselves and repair each other. And I think that there's a deeper geographic, geopolitical understanding that I think we need to go into. And again, I still think that sometimes the degrowth discourse runs away from aspects of the really difficult, toxic history of how the climate came to be so fractured and so broken, and why it is that we do need to go into decoloniality and talking about colonial afterlives to understand it much more clearly. But over to yourselves, Aya and JP.
Awesome. We have nothing to add to this one, but we're taking the next question from Kamakshi Amar. Degrowth is also criticized, saying that a degrowth in the global north will mean havoc for the economies of the global south because of the global trade. What is your opinion on that?
So yeah, thanks. I think I guess I can only reiterate what I said earlier, that this is a general, a strong fear that I hear across some of the even heterodox progressive economics or non-mainstream economics as well, which is that doing one thing is at the cost of another thing. Giving more is at the cost of having less. And that I think that also speaks to the capitalist lie, the capitalist dogma that of scarcity, that there isn't enough. And the problem is that there's more than, isn't that there isn't enough. The problem is that is the redistribution of the enough, who has control of the enough, who wants to have ownership and custodianship of the enough, and who wants to actually define the enoughness on behalf of the majority world, on behalf of, the vast majority of humanity. That is the issue.
No, 100%. And the only thing I have to add here is that something we should very much advocate for and call for in order for there, if there was let's say a drastic economic degrowth in the global north, which would affect international trade and would affect people's livelihoods, which are all interlinked, it's one of the main reasons that degrowth calls for this to be planned and for it to be internationalist, in the sense that it shouldn't just be the global north deciding to degrow. It should be in accordance to and with the leadership of the global south, right? To listen to the demands of the majority world, and done in a way that is increases the productive capacity of majority world nations, so that they can absorb a lot of the unequal exchange that would stop flowing from the majority world to the core, and likewise advocating for very particularly the increasing of food, energy, and industrial and monetary sovereignty, to ensure that these nations have the decision-making power over the resources that they control, right? And this definitely includes technological transfer as well. Again, to make sure that the productive capacity is there, so that we can provide, so that these nations can provide for themselves the public services that are necessary, the universal access to healthcare and care and ecological restoration, again, that has been the result of these extractive monopoly transnational corporations. I don't know if there's anything you wanted to say, Aya. If not, we can move on to another question. Yeah? Okay, there was a couple of +1s. You can also just put your hand up. We don't want to be this committee selecting the questions. We want this to be very participatory. I think somebody said a +1 for Gabriel's question. Gabriel, would you like to ask it yourself? Oh, yeah.
Library.
Oh.
Yeah.
Do you want to read it?
Sure. As political economists, do you think growth is an adequate analytical starting point to the understanding of the multiple colonial/imperial dynamics of exploitation under capitalism? And as an activist, do you think growth is a good category to frame a social movement that addresses social ecological transformation at the global level?
Another smashing question. So I think, I mean, the implications of growth, first we have to ask ourselves, the origins of growth, the idea of growth. And remember, the GDP, if we're using that as the broad landscape from which we begin to define and begin to situate growth in all of its toxicity, in all of its glory, in all of its goriness as well. It means then that it's, we're talking about growth as a measure of good social policy, economic policy, a measure of well-being, a measure of growing humanity's capacity to reproduce itself successfully, sustainably as well, and the capacity to do so whilst doing the least amount of harm, not only to ourselves, to each other, but to the ones who are yet to come. And I think if that is then the premise on which perhaps we can define and think about growth, I would argue then that growth at the moment is a very inadequate starting point, because the growth that we are speaking of usually is the growth of neoliberalism, the growth of export, import, the financialization of growth, the commodification of things, the commodification of life, the commodification of basic services, and so forth. And I like that you segued this into the colonial imperial complex, because what it means is that we are then living in this afterlife, an ongoing ontology of an imperial reality, right? An imperial plantation economy, actually. So remembering, if we think about somebody like Ruth Gilmore, who talks about having been abandoned economics, for example, and this whole notion that the state has abandoned people, the state has abandoned services, the state has abandoned public welfare, the state has abandoned social well-being, and has done this quite with some intent. It's not just a case of bad governance, poor choices, try some different policy choices, but it is actually a deliberate, intentional, ongoing dynamic of extraction and this race and this plunge to the bottom. And when we consider then, of course, this nexus that healthcare, well-being, economic growth, especially in so-called low-income or majority world countries has, and the linear connection between that and the extractiveness that has meant that states cannot be states in the way that they should be, right? And they are indebted in ways that we shouldn't be. And then the indicators that are used, which are basically a league table that tries then to ameliorate these complexities, that tries to then flatten the world, that tries to behave as though Lesotho and Luxembourg come from the same place. It cannot be. That Nigeria and Spain are come from the same place. It cannot be. That Nepal and Canada come from the same place. Again, it cannot be, right? That Ecuador and Germany are coming from the same starting point. Again, it just cannot be. And I think that when we think around this, which is why I'm very, very keen for us to always have in mind a framework that understands the coloniality that we're still living in, and coloniality being the ongoing manifestation of the colonial afterlife, of extractiveness, of occupation, and of the kind of narrowly framed matrix of benefits and deficits that have been apportioned by the minority world to the rest of the world. And I think that also saying that, then of course, we realize that the political economy of poverty is one that is quite intentional. The political economy of debt is also one that is quite intentional, because it upends and it supports, very neatly supports the agenda of maintaining a hegemony over the majority world, and of course, maintaining this hegemony over so-called poor countries and false dependency as well, which is a coloniality of the imagination. I hope you answered somewhat, Gabriel, even though you're in a library.
Adding to this, actually, I had a question of my own, and I'm very curious on your perspective. Something I've been doing a lot of work on recently has been propaganda and narrative control, particularly establishment propaganda. Degrowth tends to very much use this framing of decolonizing the imaginary, which to me is problematic, but I'm not gonna go much into that here. But what is true is that the global media conglomerates have an extraordinarily powerful hold on the way that we think, the way that we work, the way that we vote, the way that we feel, perceive. And it's not just the media, right? It is our educational systems. It is our parents, our friends, the comic books that we read, what our politicians say, etc., the things that we're exposed to, which very much make us think a certain way. And that predominantly is a Western imperialistic, capitalist way of thinking, or at least that's what's given the biggest microphone. So this poses a huge challenge, particularly, let's say, for degrowth, which is trying to get people to think that something that they've been taught for their entire lives to be fundamental for the benefit of humanity, growth, right? That provides jobs, that provides tax revenue, even though we know that taxes don't pay for things, that provides for stability, etc. It's just not the case, right? And I'm wondering if you have any advice on some of the most relatable or accessible narratives that have come across through your vast experiences that really click with the average individual, that might make them seem, and it doesn't necessarily have to be about growth per se, but just to think that, hey, maybe this very Western capitalist imperialist system is not all that, and there can be much more to life or our work or economy or relations than what we're told or taught. Sorry, that was a bit long.
It was long, but it was really, really good. So I think you're helping, to really point us towards kind of like I don't even want to call them alternatives, but I think the parallel ways in which we can think around why we do what we do and how we live. And I think that that is what the economy should be. It's how we do what we do and the way that we live, basically. And it's not an abstraction, it's us. It's you know, and that's again one of the great ontological falsehoods of the economy, is that it behaves as an abstraction and something that is magical, something that is you know, impermeable, something that is opaque, and that can only be understood by a few people on Wall Street or wherever. I mean, how's that working out for the rest of us, really? And I think that, you know, it's if we think about it in terms of relationality, and I think this is where, again, feminist economics has a really important, you know, role to play, and feminist political economics, which is where I originally have been grounded, right? The well-being stuff is maybe the last decade or so. And I think that it talks about relationality. It talks about the marketplace as being between people, and for us to imagine ourselves as being in a physical market, right? As being, everybody brings value, and everybody also can take value, and that there's reciprocity. It also speaks to the idea that everyone has something that they offer, that whether it's talents, whether it is languages, whether it is stories, whether it is poetry, everybody has something to give to the community. And I think that because so many things, almost everything is commodified, including the air that we breathe in some places, which has given us this idea that of this hegemony of false values, this hegemony of false prestige. So if you're driving a big car and you live in a big house and you can go to space after lunchtime, you are the important person. And of course, when I look at that, I mean, one way I have framed it previously is to say that for every $1 billion that you make, that's at least 1 billion abuses, 1 billion moments of losing your humanity, 1 billion extractive, exploitative moments. There are no righteous billionaires on this earth. None. There's not a single person who's a billionaire who made their money through kindness, generosity, fair labor practices, non-racism, non-extractive practices, not a single one. And I also have challenged a lot of people with the idea of old wealth. Well, it's old money. You know, we've had this money. You know, we've got nothing to do with stocks and shit. You know, we didn't get our money the last 50 years ago. You know, we've had our money, but from where? You know, even if you're from the European aristocracy or the descendant of, that definitely was to do with, you know, serfs and fiefdoms and all sorts of, you know, very, very unpalatable, socially restrictive ways of measuring and demarcating who is and who is not worthy, who are and are not the commoners, and so on and so forth, right? And we see that even now, which is why there's so much tension right now watching the British royal family. I mean, that is class tension manifesting in a real way as before our eyes in real time. Another thing is also to think around the fact that even if it's old money, that's money that was definitely from chattel slavery or from imperialism or colonialism or somewhere along the line. So this whole notion, there are different ways to reframe what is and is not of value, and also to turn and completely upend the idea that some people don't owe nothing because this has always been in our family. It's not true. How did your family get this? How did you acquire this land? How did you acquire this wealth? How is it that you've never worked a day in your life? You're not the smartest person in the room. No, you know, you're not the most inspiring. You're just a guy, but hey, now you're the president of the United States. How's about that?
Thank you. I really do appreciate that. Aya, do you have any other questions?
Yes.
Yeah, go for it.
I think I just want to take us more into like the personal realm. So you've been in this for like decades. How do you keep going? Like we had someone comment about powerlessness, hopelessness. And as we see, like, the world's quite bleak right now. So how can we keep going? So if you can
Thanks. Tough question, interesting question. I think it's being in community like this is really always refreshing, always invigorating. I think understanding that there are many people who are actually asking similar questions and who are wrestling with similar dilemmas, whatever our geography is also always encouraging to me. I think being in the feminist movement for me has been oxygen. It's been absolutely oxygen, and being part of the decolonial feminist movement has helps me every day to answer many questions. It helps me to make the interactions and the interlinkages between migration. So I started my first sort of entree into this work was actually working on labor migration in the context of globalization and seeing all of these connections between the past and the present, between labor and extraction, the global south and the global north, and who is actually maintaining who. And that's been, it's been extremely useful as firstly as an analytical tool, but also building so much solidarity across the world. I think the other thing is ring fencing time and space and trying to practice well-being, trying to ungrow and to degrow stuff like overtime and weekend working and all of that, because I think the burnout rate in this kind of work is high, and we have become accustomed to the nobility of the cause, even at our own cost. And I think if we're thinking around a new world and new imaginations, we have to imagine a world where you don't have to work this hard, so hard, at your own expense. That cannot be it. And I think I often say this to younger activists, if I may, as well, that it's very important that at the end of the day and at the end of your life, remember that you'll be gone. And what will be left of you. So we must, inhale and explore and redress and rejuvenate in this moment, because there are no other moments. I remember working for being a very young NGO leader about 20 years ago. I was leading an NGO that doesn't even exist anymore. And I remember falling asleep, and I tell this story often because I think it's important to shock us into how irrelevant sometimes this work is at our own expense. And I fell asleep in the office, and I thought it was, I thought I was going to leave at around 6. And I worked and worked and worked, and I woke up and it was 10:30 at night in an office in Johannesburg, and I was still at work, and I switched off and I went home. And I remember somebody saying to me, but you'll be gone one day, your name will not be on that door, and nobody will even have seen that you were here until 10:30 at night. And indeed, my name is not on that door. The door doesn't exist anymore. The organization doesn't exist anymore. And I think we have to be very precious, treat ourselves and each other as precious commodities, as very precious commodities as well. And I mean, taking courage from intergenerational interactions. I take great inspiration from students. I'm, privileged to teach. I spend a bit of time teaching. And I also take great courage and inspiration from my elders. So there was a talk in our town in Johannesburg yesterday. Many of us will probably know Professor Ruth Gilmore, the abolition geography. And speaking to her for a few moments, I mean, she's 74 and still at it and still excited and still motivated and still traveling the world and still coming to give solidarity to so many of us. And she's my elder as well. And just drawing that inspiration and drawing from the fact that she's 74, she's still at it, and she's still so excited and inspired by what has to be done. And so why shouldn't I be as well? So there's a lot that we can do to make sure that we are present, healthy, and whole for the work that needs to be done.
Thank you so much for those words and reminding us that actually the preciousness of life, we're not here for a long time, and cherish each other, ourselves, and hopefully make it a little better along the way. We're really, really, really thankful to have you here with us, and we'll be ending here in case anyone has any pressing questions. Let me just check the chat. Or if anyone wants to chime in, this is the time.
And I just wanted folks to know that I've sent a couple links out on the chat. with a bit more information about why this call was organized today, and where you can learn more about Lebohang's work, and as well as the work that the IDN is doing.
Yeah. So I guess on this note, we will be ending. Thank you so much for being with us, truly. We're very grateful to hear your perspective. And we really, these conversations, your words really needs to be heard. And, you know, sitting with that tension and the friction is what we really need to be doing. So thank you again. And thank you to everyone who came here. So grateful to have everyone.
Yeah, really. Thank you so much. We truly appreciate it. The degrowth movement definitely needs many more conversations like this. Stick around, folks, for the other two talks that we'll be having. One is next week, and then the other one is next week with speakers from South America and India to hear more about their perspectives on the tensions between the degrowth movement and global South movements. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Ciao. Take care, everybody. I think we can, I don't know if maybe we should stop the recording first. I mean, maybe we can give ourselves there.